Hello and welcome to another video. And in this video, we will be talking about the generative AI pipeline. But before we discuss the pipeline, we need to first go through some basic understanding about the generative AI. So you may already have used different chat models like ChatGPT, Google Gemini, and some of the other large language models. So most of these large language models are based on the generative AI. Now, the generative AI is much different than the machine learning and the deep learning. Machine learning, which is primarily a predictive model, which means it is basically doing the prediction whether the input that you have provided is exactly like the expected output or not. For example, in the machine learning, you have presented the image of an animal, and the machine learning model will predict that whether this animal is a cat or dog, or what is the probability that it is a cat or a dog. So, the machine learning models primarily are the prediction models, whereas the generative AI, now, what it does that the generative AI generates new output or new data based on the trained data or based on the data that it has trained on. And the new output in the generative AI, it could be a text, image, or audio. Okay. So, for example, if you already have used the chat GPT, so we are giving a prompt. Okay, you are giving a prompt that please make me an image of a dog. Okay, and some whatever the behavior you want to provide. So you are giving the input in text, and from that text input, it is generating a new output in the image form. Okay, so the generative AI basically is creating a new output or new data. Now, how it is creating the new output or the new data that is based on the training of that model. So I will give you some more examples that what is the training and how it is creating the new data. But before we continue, it is very important to understand the key difference between the generative AI and the machine learning or the other artificial intelligence methodologies. So here we have another example, uh, the discriminative versus the generative AI. Now, the discriminative model, which is primarily based on the machine learning models, uh, it is basically just doing the prediction. Okay, so for example, you have presented two images, one of cat and one of a dog. So these two images are going into the machine learning model, and the machine learning model is doing the prediction whether this particular image, image number one, is it a cat or dog? Then the second input later on, whether it is a cat or dog. So it is doing the prediction. Whereas in the generative AI or the generative models, the input is completely unlabeled data. Okay, there is no specific input, or the input is totally raw data or unlabeled data. And based on that, the generative model will generate something new. Okay, it is creating something new. It is not predicting here, it is creating something new. Okay, so that is the basic difference between the machine learning or which is the discriminative model versus the generative AI. So let's go back. So again, the generative AI generates the new output, the new data, and that new data could be text, image, or any format based on the trained data. So what do we mean by the trained data? So here, for example, we have the large language model. Okay, so this basically is the generative AI model. We can just call it the large language model, LLM. Now, this model has been trained. Okay, this model has been trained on some specific data. So let's say this model has been trained on the animal data. So, most like all the common animals, like let's say 50 or 100 very common animals have been trained on this data, like the shapes of those animals, the images or the habits of those animals, what do they eat. So, whatever is the relevant information about those animals. So, this large language model like ChatGPT, for example, you are creating your own version of ChatGPT. So your large language model is trained on animal data, which means that if you will ask any question about any animal, it will be successfully responding with the correct answer. So, for example, the question could be that please, make me an image of an animal who is, eating some specific food or who is drinking water. So this will be the input, and the because the large language model has lots of trained data about the habits, about the images, and lots of other stuff. So a new data, again, the large language model will not just go and search for the relevant data, okay, or the data that you are asking for. It will not fetch the data. In fact, what it will do, it will generate a new output. Okay, so that will be the response of the large language model. So that is extremely important, that the large language models or the generative AI models, they generate the new data based on the trained data. Definitely, you need to first train your model based on some category, for example, the animal category, or let's say the medical category. So let's say you are creating a medical chatbot. So what you will have to do, you will have to first train your model based on all the medical vocabulary and all the medical terminologies, what is influenza, what is fever, and so on. So you'll be creating your medical chatbot or your medical large language model. And then whatever you ask about fever or any other disease, so the large language model will generate the output. That output will be something new. It is not going to fetch like in Google. It search for the exact keywords or exact sentences and then just show you those words. So that is not the case in the large language model. It basically generates a new data, a new output based on the trained data. All right. So now we have the basic idea about what is the machine learning and what is the generative AI. So again, machine learning are all the predictive models. So here, if we look at a bigger picture, so the artificial intelligence, again, it's a very broad spectrum. As we can see here, artificial intelligence, it's a very broad and a big subject. Within the artificial intelligence comes the machine learning. Now, again, artificial intelligence alone is not something. To implement or to achieve the artificial intelligence. You will have to perform the machine learning or any other models. So basically, the machine learning is one of the subset of artificial intelligence. Okay. Then within the machine learning comes the deep learning. Now, deep learning uses the neural networks. So again, the deep learning is for very complicated models, especially if you are using images or if you have lots of inputs, like thousands of inputs you are giving to your model. So in that case, you will have to use the deep learning. So deep learning is one of the subset of machine learning. So again, machine learning can be used for not very complicated models. For example, in the machine learning, the input could be in Excel sheets, in text format. You are providing the input, and based on that, some output or some prediction will be made. But when the input data is more complex, then you'll have to rely on deep learning. So deep learning, the key thing here is that the deep learning uses the neural networks. Then you have the generative AI. Now, the generative AI is the subset of deep learning. So, deep learning already uses the neural networks. So, relying on that technology, which uses the neural networks, we will be using the generative AI. So, all the large language models, all the generative AI models, they basically use the deep learning or the neural networks. So all the generative AI models, they use the neural networks, and based on that, all the large language models are generating the images and text, whatever the output you see on the chat GPT or any other large language model. So here again, we have the same information. So AI is the field of study. So in order to study AI, you will have to learn or study some of these components. So within AI, you have machine learning. So ML. is a branch of AI that focuses on creating the machines that learn from data. Okay. Then we have deep learning. So deep learning is the subset of machine learning, and it is based on the artificial neural networks. And then you have the generative AI, which is the subset of deep learning. And again, it is a more advanced way of using the artificial neural networks. So the generative AI is the subset of deep learning, and the generative AI large language models are trained on the large amounts of unstructured and unlabeled data. So what is the unlabeled data? So before we understand the unlabeled data, let's go through what is the labeled data. Now in the machine learning, normally what happens that we are using the labeled data. So what is the labeled data? Let's say we have an Excel sheet, and the Excel sheet has different columns. So let's say these are the different columns. So this is column number one, two, three, four, and each of these columns have certain input. So these are all the inputs. Okay, and then in the last column, this is column number five, you have the output. Okay, so here in the last column you have the output. So let's say the input we have, let's say we are going to predict whether the image is of a cat or a dog. So in the first column it will specify that what type of ears that the animal has. Okay, so this will have information about the ears, what type of eyes the animal has. Okay, what type of skin. Okay, and some other information. And then in the fifth column you will have the output. So if like type of ears, okay, whatever type of eyes, let's say blue eyes, skin, whatever the type of skin, and whatever the fourth input variable. And based on that, if these four input variables are available, the output is going to be that it's a cat. Okay, and then you will have another row. So you will have the type of ears and eyes, skin, and the last one, and then the output. So based on that, the output will be of a dog. Okay, now here the variables, the input variables are mapped to the output variable. So this is the like the training data. So when you are training the machine learning models, you will have, let's say, 50,000 rows like this, 50,000 rows or 10,000 rows like this, with different information about ears, eyes, and all that stuff. So the first four or first five or first 20 columns will be of input fields, and the last column will be the output or the answer. Okay, so the label data basically means that all these input fields are mapped to the output field. And this is when you are training your machine learning models. So when you are going to predict, so again, when you are going to predict, you will enter these four input variables: the first one, second one, third one, fourth one, and okay, so all these four. And then, so these are all going to be the input variables, and the output variable here will be predicted by the machine learning model. So it will be a cat or a dog. Okay, it will be a cat or a dog. Okay, so this is when the prediction will be made. But during the training, the data will be the labeled data, which means that the input fields will be mapped to one of the output fields. Okay, so as we can see here, that the generative AI large language models are trained on large amount of unstructured and unlabeled data, which means for the generative AI, we will not be having this convenience of the labeled data. In fact, of the labeled data, as we can see here, we will have the unlabeled data, which means that there will be no mapping of the between the input and the output. In fact, the data that we will have is the unstructured data, for example, images, okay, images, different type of text documents, okay, web information. Okay, so like there is no mapping between the input and the output. So that is the basic idea of the unlabeled and the unstructured data. So raw text, for example, so that is an example of the unstructured data, which means that we don't have like these columns, or and we don't have the headings of these columns. So this is if we don't have this case, so it is unstructured data or the unlabeled data. So all the large language models are trained on large amounts of the unstructured and the unlabeled data. And then the large language models are machine learning models, because again everything is being evolved from the machine learning. So like from machine learning we have deep learning, and then from deep learning we have the generative AI, and within generative AI we have all these large language models. So the large language models are machine learning models to process and understand the natural language for forms such as text to text generation, text to image generation, and image to text generation. So this is also very important, that all the LLMs, they have the capability to understand the natural language. Okay. So again, when you are working in the large language models, one area is very important, which is called the prompt engineering. Okay, prompt engineering, which means you should be able to know how to write good prompts, because all the large language models are dealing with the natural language, which means they have the capability to understand the natural language, or to generate the output like a natural language. Okay. So the prompt engineering is one important feature. And other than that, you also need to know that how to break the natural language, okay, or how to make the natural language much better and much more readable for the machine language. So here is an example of the label data. So as we can see here, that all of these columns are the input fields, and the last one, that is the output field, which is the prediction whether it will rain or not. Okay. So for example, the if this is the minimum temperature, and the evaporation, sunshine, wind speed, wind direction, humidity, and all of these input parameters, based on that, what will be the output? So this is the label data, because while training the machine learning models, you are creating a map. So all these input fields are mapped with the output data. Okay, so that is just an example of the label data. So again, in the generative AI, we don't have the labeled data. In fact, we will have the unlabeled and the unstructured data. Another important thing to know about the generative AI is that, as we discussed, that most of the large language models are based on the generative AI. So we have two terms. One is the large language models, and the other one is called the language models. So the language models, which are just called the LM, is a model that is trained to perform a specific task. For example, the language translation, okay, or the sentiment analysis, or any specific task. So it is primarily designed to complete just one task. Whereas the large language models can perform multiple tasks. For example, text to image generation, and image to text generation, and text to audio generation, or any other type of task. So all the chat GPTs and all the models by Google or by Facebook, these are primarily the large language models. And here we have some of the major large language models. So we have the GPT model by OpenAI. We have Google Gemini, and Llama, Mistral, Falcon, and we have hundreds of large language models available. And in the coming videos, I will show you some of the open source large language models and the paid ones as well. So we have a website where you can see hundreds of open source large language models. So in the next videos, we will see lots of details about the generative AI. So now let's come up to the topic of the generative AI pipeline. Okay, now what is the pipeline? So pipeline basically are the steps to follow if you want to develop any generative AI application. Okay, so if a company, or if someone has given you the requirements that they are looking for a solution that is based on the generative AI, So that could be, let's say, creating a model of text to image generation or text to audio generation or any other kind of generative AI model. So what you will have to do, you just need to follow the pipeline. So pipeline are basically the sequential steps that you need to follow. And in the upcoming videos, we will be having one separate video for each step. So the first step we have is the data acquisition. Now again, in the previous slide, so if you go back, so we saw there that all the large language models are based on the large amounts of unstructured and unlabeled data. So whenever you are creating any generative AI application, you need to train your model. And in order to train your model, you need to get the data. So data acquisition is the first step. So this data could be in PDF format. You can get the data from the internet. You can just go to different websites, and you can get the text from different websites. And other than that, you can also have different surveys. Even you can ask the chat GPT or any language model to give the data for you. Okay. So basically the purpose of the data acquisition is to acquire the data based on which your generative AI model will be trained. So that is the data acquisition. The second step we have is the data preparation. So data preparation means that the data that you already have collected, you need to clean the data. Okay, you need to clean the data. Maybe you will have to remove for example, you will have to remove the HTML tags, or maybe you will have to remove some unnecessary words or repetitive, any words which keeps on repeating many times. Then the third step we have is feature engineering. So the purpose of the feature engineering basically is to convert the text to numbers. Okay, text to number. So all this text data will be converted into number format, and or we can say that we will convert the text information into vectors. We will convert the text data into vectors, because all the models, whether it's a machine learning or the generative AI models, they only understand numbers. And for that, you will have to create the vector database. Okay, so that is the step of the feature engineering, and we'll have again dedicated videos for all of these steps. Then you will have to decide that which model you want to use. Okay, so which as we said that there are different open source models and there are different paid models available. So you'll have to decide that which model you will be using for that particular generative AI project. So that is the model selection. Once you will select the model, you will have to evaluate whether this model is working fine or not. If not, you can change the model, and later on you will deploy your application. You will deploy your application to the cloud or to your local premises. So that is the deployment part. And once it has been deployed, then you will have to continuously monitor and update the model. So updating the model means you will have to update the model with new text with new text or new type of information or any other kind of optimization. So this is what you will have to do. So this basically is the generative AI pipeline. Okay, this is the generative AI pipeline. And for each step, we will have a separate video. And then later on, we will be working on some complete end-to-end projects using the generative AI.